All right, so you guys wanted us to like get into these LA wildfires,
Right.
and I gotta say these articles from AP News and CBS News have some wild details, like stuff you wouldn't believe. So we're gonna go beyond the headlines here. We're gonna like right into the middle of what started these things, how they spread so fast, and the real impact they're having on people's lives.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating case study, even though it's devastating. I mean, these fires really make you rethink how wildfires work.
Hmm.
You've got like celebrity homes that are now piles of ash.
Hmm.
People are talking about fire tornadoes. And there's even this one story about a churro seller who basically turned into a hero.
Okay, so first things first, can we talk about the timing here? It's January. I thought after all that record rain California had last year, like things were supposed to be wetter, not on fire.
Yeah, that's the thing. These fires, they kind of throw a wrench in the whole idea of California wildfire season. It's like a sign that climate change is changing the rules of the game, making these fires harder to predict and harder to prepare for.
Okay, so let's go through the timeline here. First, we've got the Palisades fire. It starts, and then bam, it just rips through Pacific Palisades. And those crazy Santa Ana winds are like fueling the whole thing.
Oh yeah, those winds are a huge factor. They're hot and dry, blasting westward from the desert. Imagine them like funneling through the canyons, picking up speed and intensity. It's like the perfect recipe for a fire to spread super fast.
The article said they were hitting like 75 miles per hour. Okay, so those winds create the perfect conditions. But what about the actual fuel for these fires? Is it just like dry brush or is there more to it?
It's like a bunch of things together. You've got the dry vegetation, of course, but how we manage our forests is part of the problem too. Like we've been suppressing fires for decades, and that's led to a ton of flammable stuff building up. It's like creating a tinderbox that's just waiting for a spark.
So dry conditions plus strong winds plus a ton of fuel. Yeah, that's starting to sound pretty scary.
And we're seeing this same pattern around the world, like in Australia with those massive bushfires and the Amazon rainforest fires too. They all point to these same underlying issues.
Okay, so back to LA. The Palisades fire wasn't the only one, right?
Right. Almost at the same time, you have the Eaton fire starting up near Pasadena. Then you have the Sunset Fire in the Hollywood Hills, and more recently, the Woodley Fire near that wildlife reserve.
It's like the city was surrounded by fire. And with so many fires breaking out at once, how are fire crews supposed to keep up?
That's a huge issue. Resources are stretched thin, especially with those water shortages making things even more complicated. We're
Yeah.
talking about firefighters facing incredible challenges. They're not just battling the flames. They're also dealing with limited resources.
And then there's the human side of this disaster. The articles are full of these stories that just grab you, like residents running away on foot, some having to leave their cars behind because embers were raining down around them. There was even this one couple in Malibu. They had to deal with two separate fires in just a few weeks, and they lost a lifetime of writing in the process.
It makes you think about the emotional toll, like losing your home, your belongings, your sense of security. That's something that stays with you long after the flames are gone.
Definitely. There's this one guy, Michael, who lives in Hastings Ranch. He came back to find his house was still standing, but so many of his neighbors' homes were just gone.
Yeah. It's like this heartbreaking mix of loss and survival. And this is where you really see the strength of the community.
Yeah.
People opening their homes to those who had to evacuate, volunteers showing up to the shelters, donations pouring in. It really shows how resilient and compassionate people can be.
One story that really got to me was about this churro seller. He literally saved his family's home and their business by grabbing a hose and spraying everything down as the embers fell around them. Talk about thinking fast.
That story is wild.
Hmm.
It really shows how strong that instinct is to protect what's important to you, even when you're facing something so dangerous. It also makes you wonder about how prepared people are for something like this. What can people do to protect themselves and their property when something like this happens?
That's a good point. It's not just about the firefighters. There's a lot that individuals can do to reduce their risk.
Exactly. We need to move away from just reacting to these events and start thinking about how to prevent them.
And we can't forget about those cultural and historical losses, like the Bunny Museum in Altadena, that quirky landmark that was full of bunny-related stuff. It was completely destroyed by the Eaton fire.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these fires, they're not just about property damage. They're also wiping away pieces of our history and identity.
Man, it's just heartbreaking to think about everything that's been lost. And the impact goes way beyond just the people in the path of the flames. These articles talk about schools shutting down, Hollywood productions coming to a halt, even sporting events getting canceled.
It really shows you how connected everything is. These fires have these ripple effects that mess up daily life for so many people. You
Yeah.
mentioned school closures. Imagine being a student at Palisades Charter High School. You know, the one from Carrie and Teen Wolf? All of a sudden, your school's in the middle of a real-life disaster movie.
That's crazy. And what about the economic hit? Businesses are destroyed, people's jobs are disrupted. That has to have a massive impact on these communities.
Absolutely. We tend to focus on the damage we can see right away, but the long-term effects on the economy can be devastating. Rebuilding takes time and resources, and a whole lot of resilience.
The articles also mentioned that the air quality in LA plummeted. I guess that's not surprising with all the smoke and ash in the air.
Yeah, that's another ripple effect. Bad air quality can cause respiratory problems, especially for people who are already vulnerable, like kids and older folks. It's a reminder that these fires have health consequences that reach way beyond the areas that are burning.
It's a total mess. And with so many fires happening at the same time, wouldn't that also make it harder to fight them because resources are so stretched?
Definitely. You have all these fires, and they're all competing for the same limited firefighters' equipment and water. This kind of situation forces people to make tough choices, like where to send resources. And that can be incredibly stressful for those on the front lines.
I remember reading that water shortages were a big problem. Is that because the fires are using up so much water?
That's part of it,
Uh-huh.
but it's also connected to the larger issue of drought and water management in California. These fires are happening at a time when water resources are already stretched thin, which makes it even harder to fight the fires.
Okay, so let's go back to those Santa Ana winds for a minute. You mentioned they're a big factor in how fires spread, but how do they actually work?
So picture this. You've got dry air coming down from the Great Basin. That's a high-pressure zone. And it's moving towards the California coast, which is a low-pressure zone. As this air flows downhill, it gets compressed and heats up. And that creates those hot, dry winds we call the Santa Anas.
So it's not just wind, it's hot wind, which dries everything out even more.
Exactly. And these winds can blow through canyons and valleys, creating what we call a downslope wind effect, which makes them even faster and hotter. This means that even a tiny ember can turn into a huge fire hazard.
The articles mention that these winds can carry embers for miles. That sounds terrifying. Like the fires are jumping around, starting new fires as they go.
Yeah, that's the danger of what we call ember attack.
Oh.
These embers get blown by the wind, and they can land way ahead of the main fire, starting new fires in places you wouldn't expect. It's a nightmare for firefighters trying to get the blaze under control.
It makes you wonder, are these Santa Ana winds a new thing? Or have they always been a part of California's climate?
They're a natural part of the weather patterns in this region. But climate change is making them worse. As temperatures rise, we're seeing these winds become stronger, hotter, and more frequent, and that makes fires even more likely.
So it's not just the winds themselves, it's how climate change is making them more intense.
Exactly. And this brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, about how wildfire season is changing. These fires aren't just a problem in California, they're happening all over the world.
I've seen those satellite pictures of the fire spreading. It's like watching the earth burn.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark visual. It reminds us of how powerful nature is and how interconnected everything is on our planet.
Speaking of interconnectedness, did these fires affect anything beyond LA?
Well, the fires caused so much disruption that even the Academy Awards had to push back their nomination voting and announcements. It shows you how these events can impact things you wouldn't expect.
Wow, so even Hollywood wasn't safe.
And we saw similar disruptions in the sports world. The NHL had to cancel the LA Kings home game, and even the NFL had backup plans in case the Rams playoff game had to be moved.
It's crazy to think that something like wildfires could mess with major entertainment and sports events.
Yeah, it shows you the unexpected ways these events can affect our lives on so many different levels.
What about the government's response to this disaster? I remember President Biden canceling a trip to Italy because of the fires and declaring a federal emergency for California.
It's a big deal because it makes federal resources available for disaster relief and recovery. It shows that the government knows how serious this is, and they're committed to helping those who are affected.
But it also sounds like there's a lot more to do beyond the immediate relief. Like, how do we stop these megafires from happening over and over again?
That's the big question. It's complicated, and there's no easy answer. But there are a few things we need to focus on.
Like what? Give me some hope here.
Well, first, we need to deal with the root cause. Climate change. That means reducing greenhouse gas emissions, switching to renewable energy sources, and promoting sustainable ways to manage our land. It's a global effort that requires us to change how we live and consume.
Okay, that's a huge one. But what about things we can do more immediately?
There are things we can do locally, too. We can improve how we manage forests by thinning out dense vegetation, doing controlled burns to reduce the amount of fuel, and creating defensible spaces around homes.
I've heard that controlled burns can be controversial. Why is that?
It's a tricky balance. Controlled burns can be a good way to lower the risk of fire, but they also have their own risks, especially if they're not done properly. There's also the historical context. Indigenous communities have used fire as a land management tool for centuries, but that practice has been suppressed. We need to rethink how we view fire and find ways to work with it, not just try to eliminate it.
That makes sense. It's like we've been trying to get rid of fire completely, but it's a natural part of the ecosystem.
Exactly. We need to figure out how to live with fire in a way that's safe for us and good for the environment.
So it sounds like we need a combination of big picture solutions, like tackling climate change, and more practical things we can do on the ground, like better forest management.
Absolutely. And it's not just about what governments and organizations do. It's about individuals taking action too. We can all do things to reduce our carbon footprint, be careful about fire safety, and support policies that promote sustainability.
That brings us back to that churro seller who saved his home. He didn't wait for someone else to do it. He took action.
That's such a powerful image. It shows that even when we're facing huge challenges, we can still make a difference.
It's inspiring to think about how resilient and resourceful people are in these communities.
And it's important to remember that there will always be people who step up to help others, even during the toughest times.
The articles talk about people letting evacuees stay in their homes, volunteering at shelters, donating supplies. That gives me hope.
It speaks to something fundamental in us as humans, that desire to connect, to support each other, and to rebuild stronger together.
But what about the people who take advantage of a crisis? I read about 2 guys who were arrested for looting during the fires. It's hard to believe that some people would do something so awful.
It's sad but true. Whenever there's a disaster, there will be people who try to exploit the situation for their own benefit. It reminds us that even when there's tragedy, we need to be careful and protect ourselves and our communities.
It's a good reminder to watch out for scams and people trying to cheat others. That kind of stuff often happens after disasters.
You're right. It's important to be cautious. Make sure information is accurate before you donate to charities, and report any suspicious activity to the authorities.
It's a shame that people have to worry about that, on top of everything else.
It definitely adds more stress, but it also shows that being resilient as a community means looking out for each other and holding those who try to take advantage of the situation accountable.
It sounds like there's so much to think about, both the damage these fires have caused and the complex reasons why they happened. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all.
It's definitely a lot to take in, but I think it's important to acknowledge those feelings of being overwhelmed
Yeah.
without letting them turn into despair. There's a lot we can do, both as individuals and together, to face these challenges and build a future where we're more resilient.
So what's your message for anyone listening who might be feeling overwhelmed right now?
I would say, first, acknowledge what you're feeling. It's normal to feel sad, angry, scared, or even hopeless when you see something as devastating as this.
But don't let those emotions stop you from doing something.
Exactly. Use those emotions to fuel action. Learn about the issues. Get involved in your community. Support organizations that are working on climate change and wildfire prevention. Make sustainable choices in your own life. Even small actions can make a difference.
It's about finding that balance between understanding how serious things are and knowing that we can be part of the solution.
And it's about remembering that we're not alone in this. There are so many people around the world working towards a future that's more sustainable and resilient.
That's good to hear. It's easy to get caught up in all the negative stuff and forget about the positive things people are doing.
It's important to celebrate those victories, big or small. Every step we take towards a more sustainable future is a step in the right direction.
This conversation has been so insightful, but I'm curious, what are some of the key things you want listeners to remember about these LA wildfires?
The most important thing is that these fires are a wake-up call. They're not just a California problem. They're a global issue. And they're fueled by climate change and unsustainable practices.
It's a stark reminder that climate change is having real consequences right now, and it's impacting people's lives in devastating ways.
And it's not just about the immediate damage from the fires. It's about the ripple effects, the economic losses, the health impacts, the disruptions to daily life. These fires show us where our systems are vulnerable and how urgently we need to change things.
We can't keep ignoring these warning signs.
Exactly. We need to shift away from just reacting and start focusing on prevention and adaptation. That means addressing the root causes of climate change, investing in sustainable practices, and preparing our communities for a future where extreme weather events are more common and more intense.
So while the situation is serious, it's not hopeless. There are things we can do, both individually and collectively, to reduce the risks and create a future where we're better able to bounce back.
I completely agree. It starts with acknowledging the problem, educating ourselves, and taking action.
And it's about remembering that we're not alone in this fight.
Right. There's a global movement of people working towards a future that's more sustainable and just. We need to connect with that energy, support each other, and never give up hope.
That's a powerful message. I'm feeling more motivated now, even amidst all this devastation.
That's what I hope listeners take away from this conversation. It's not about dwelling on the negative. It's about channeling those emotions into positive action.
We can't change what's already happened, but we can shape the future.
Exactly. And it starts with each one of us.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone deeper than the headlines. We've talked about the science of wildfires, the impact they have on communities, and what we can do to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
I hope this conversation has helped listeners to understand these complex issues better and inspired them to be part of the solution.
It's been a real eye-opener. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of wildfires, and I appreciate your insights.
It's been my pleasure. I'm always happy to share what I've learned and encourage others to explore these important topics in more depth.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add? Any final thoughts or advice for our listeners?
I would say stay curious, stay informed, and stay involved. The more we understand these issues, the better decisions we can make, and the more meaningful action we can take.
That's great advice. It's about giving ourselves the knowledge we need, and then using that knowledge to make a positive impact.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. And taking action together is how we create a future that's more sustainable and resilient.
Okay, so we've dug pretty deep here, but it still feels like we've only scratched the surface. But I think we've given everyone a good foundation to understand how complex these LA wildfires really are.
Yeah, and hopefully we've piqued some interest to learn even more.
Before we go, let's distill some key takeaways. First, these fires are a major wake-up call about climate change. It's not some far-off threat anymore. It's shaping these events right now.
Totally. Drier conditions, higher temperatures, those weird wind patterns, all those things are making these fires worse, not just in California, but all around the world.
And remember those Santa Ana winds? They're not just strong winds, they're hot and dry, like giant bellows making the fires more intense and spreading those embers everywhere.
And the way we've been managing our forests is part of the problem too. Decades of trying to stop all fires have led to this buildup of fuel. It's like we've created a tinderbox that's just waiting for a spark.
So you've got these natural factors, plus human actions and climate change, all coming together to create these mega fires.
And we can't forget about the human cost. Losing homes, livelihoods, pieces of history. That impact lasts way longer than the immediate damage.
We talked about the ripple effects too. Schools closing businesses, shutting down, air quality going downhill. These fires disrupt our everyday lives in ways we don't always realize.
Yeah, it highlights how connected everything is, how these events affect us on so many levels, from our health and well-being to the economy and our culture.
So what can we actually do about it? It can feel pretty overwhelming.
It is a huge challenge, but there are things we can do. Globally, tackling climate change is key. Shifting to renewable energy, reducing our carbon footprint, promoting sustainable land management. Those are all essential parts of the solution.
But what about things we can do right now in our own communities?
We can push for better forest management support, controlled burns, and create defensible spaces around our homes. We can also be prepared by having an evacuation plan and knowing how to stay safe during a wildfire.
And let's not forget about the power of community. The stories of people helping each other, opening up their homes, volunteering, donating. Those stories give me hope.
Yeah, it shows you how resilient people can be, even in the face of disaster.
So you've heard the facts, you've heard the stories. Now it's time to take action. Even small steps can make a difference.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. We can build a more resilient future, but we have to work together.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into the LA wildfires. We went from the headlines to those heartbreaking stories, from the science behind these fires to what we can do to prevent them.
I hope this deep dive has encouraged you to learn more, do more, and be part of the solution.
It's been eye-opening for sure. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep that hope alive.